You're listening to Speaking Sidemount, the podcast where we talk all things sidemount diving, from equipment, skills, techniques, and sidemount diving expeditions to interviews with some of the world's top sidemount divers. Whether you're new to sidemount, been sidemount diving for years, or just want to know more, this is the place for all things sidemount. I'm your host, Steve Davis. Let's get wet. Hey, welcome back to Speaking Sidemount. I'm Steve Davis. Well, I'm super excited to bring you this, my 50th episode of Speaking Sidemount. Over the past 20 months, I've worked really hard to seek out and interview the very best from the world of sidemount and cave diving. I've sought to inform, to inspire, help to improve, and hopefully make your sidemount diving just a little safer. It's been unbelievably hard work, but it hasn't often felt that way. One constant has been all of you, and I'm incredibly grateful for all of your support and the many messages of thanks and encouragement that I get every week. I'm also thankful for the support of many great divers who've agreed to be my guests on the show. Most of them didn't even know me prior to me reaching out, and yet all of them have graciously given their time and shared an immense amount of knowledge that we can all now benefit from. I also want to thank Pieter and the team at XDEEP for their support. It was no small thing for XDEEP to step up when we were only 2 months old and support this show. And it's no understatement to say, without their support, it would have been really difficult for me to have got to this point. And so now, with 50 episodes in our back catalogue, it's time to look to the future. It's time to map out what the next 50 episodes look like and how we can build upon the amazing past 2 years. It's absolutely my plan to grow the podcast and associated content further. I'd like to deliver more great content, improve the production quality, take it on the road, and ultimately deliver even a better podcast to you, my listeners. Now, to support this, I recently launched the Speaking Sidemount Patreon community, which allows you to make a modest but really important contribution to support the show. I'm incredibly grateful to my foundation patrons and look forward to more of you joining us in the future. Now, one fundamental change starting with this episode is that while we continue to release 2 high-quality episodes every month, only one episode will be available on public release. The other one will be a premium patron-only episode. So in a nutshell, patrons will have access to all episodes, while the public will only have access to 1 episode per month. Now, I understand there is so much free content out there. However, I truly believe that the quality of each episode of Speaking Sidemount, the value and the knowledge that they deliver, and the effort that it takes to produce them is worthy of a small investment on our listeners' part. I've priced this to be really affordable, and the entry level for premium episode access is only $5 per month. So I hope that you'll join our community and become a patron of the show. All of the information that you need is available on www.patreon.com/speakingsidemount, and a link is in the show notes. And so, on with this episode. There is no doubt that the world is struggling against the COVID-19 pandemic. Some countries and people are doing okay, while others are suffering terribly. While being locked down, we're all trying to make the best of it, and one shining light is the huge amount of digital content being created right now as divers struggle to stay in touch with their passion for diving. There are live sessions, YouTube videos, and a truckload of often hilarious Facebook stories to keep us all engaged and somewhat sane. No question, it's no fun being dry. And so when Chris Jewell gave us an insight via YouTube into his really interesting sidemount setup for UK sump diving, I just had to ask him about it. As you all will, or let me say, should know, Chris is a member of the British Cave Diving Group and was part of the team involved in the Thai cave rescue nearly 2 years ago. Chris took part in the actual extraction dives of the rescue, and in doing so became part of history as a key part of one of the greatest rescues of modern times. Awards, accolades, and numerous TV and speaking appearances followed, and so it's awesome nearly 2 years later to catch up with Chris and ask him about how he got into cave diving, his experience in training and becoming part of the CDG, the importance of mentoring to the CDG training process. Chris reflects on his experience in Thailand some 2 years since the rescue, and he also shares more on his terrifying Lost Line episode while extracting one of the boys from the cave. Chris and I discuss the distinctions between sump diving and traditional cave diving, and how this then drives decisions about your sidemount equipment configuration We talk conceptually about carrying a long hose, gas sharing scenarios, and some of Chris's favourite exploration projects. All this and much more in this episode of Speaking Sidemount. Hey Chris, welcome to Speaking Sidemount.
Thanks very much for inviting me. Thanks for having me on.
That's great. And hey, it's awesome to have you on. Obviously, most of the world should know the name Chris Jewell by now. If they don't, they're going to find out pretty soon. But can you share a little bit about how you got into diving?
I'm a cave diver. I've been cave diving since 2006. Cave diving in the UK, so in kind of muddy sumps. And been on a number of expeditions over those years and progressed up to rebreather diving and various forms of exploration diving, typically in quite remote locations. So I'm a caver first and foremost. So I'm quite at home lugging my gear down a deep cave, a deep pothole, and getting into a sump at the bottom of that cave and going off and exploring that sump. And then, well, I guess it's a couple of years ago, I was one of the British cave divers who's out in Thailand as part of the rescue of the 12 boys and their football coach from Tam Luang Cave.
But obviously you don't wake up one day and say, hey, I'm a cave diver. So how did you get from, were you a dry caver before you became a cave diver?
Yeah, absolutely. So I learned to dive in the open water. I did a BZAC course in the UK, and then my basic PADI course. And then I was with a friend at university, and we'd been away on a military training camp. So I was in the Army Cadets. And the friend said to me on the way home, he said, I fancy joining the caving club. Have you heard of this caving club thing? And I thought, I know, that sounds kind of interesting. He didn't bother joining, but I went along on their kind of first weekend away, and I thought this is pretty good. And we were used to being on this kind of military camp where we were woken up in the morning with a bugle and someone shouting at us. And on this caving weekend, I got woken up with a cup of tea and a fried breakfast. And then we kind of put our gear on and went down a muddy hole in the ground. And I thought, hey, this is a bit of a laugh. So I got stuck into caving. I found it really, really addictive. The sport appealed to me, but the characters as well, the people involved in it. And I think cavers are a very pragmatic bunch, kind of no nonsense, kind of work out how it's going to operate. It's a fairly straightforward sport. There's not kind of too many kind of egos in it, luckily. The sport itself appealed to me. And then through the sport, the opportunity to do exploration. And I was taken on a caving expedition, only kind of, I suppose, must have been 9 months after I started caving. I had the opportunity to go out to Austria and explore some dry caves, so not diving. But I got absolutely hooked on it. The kind of thrill of exploration absolutely hooked me, and the people and the opportunity to go and do this amazing sport. And I carried on with the sport of caving, and I carried on with the sport of diving, and I kept the two separate for quite a few years, about 4 or 5 years. And eventually then in 2006, I brought them together. And by that point, I'd worked up to do quite a lot of open water diving, not at a very technical level, but I'd become a PADI instructor. I'd spent some time abroad and, was really comfortable in the water. Came back to the UK and took the caving skills and the diving skills, combined them, put on a side mount harness for the first time, put on a pair of, would have been 7-litre steel cylinders, went for a dive around a mine under the guidance of one of the members of the cave diving group in the UK, who became my mentor and kind of showed me the ropes and allowed me to kind of get into the sport of cave diving. Yeah,
I had a brilliant interview with Mike Thomas way, way back in episode 25. He sends his regards, by the way. He said, don't let Chris's head get too big, so I'm not sure what that's about. Awesome character, and I think one of the things I've enjoyed about the guys that I've been able to meet in the CDG is there's an awesome sense of humour in there as well. And we spent a fair amount of time talking about the cave diving group, and just to bring it back to the forefront of this conversation, what is it about the CDG that is different from other types of cave diving? I guess we'd call them agencies or clubs.
Yep.
Yeah, what's different about the CDG?
So the CDG is actually the oldest recreational diving club in the world. So it's got a real history. And to be clear, it's not an agency. So I'm not even going to use the word training. There's what we call mentoring in the cave diving group. So rather than join the cave diving group, pay your money, do your course, get your ticket, actually instead you apply to join the cave diving group to become a member. Membership has to be voted on by the people in the group. And you have to find someone who's going to propose you and second you. And the key thing about that proposal and that second is they become your mentors. They're the people who say, right, I'm going to take this person under my wing. I'm going to show them the ropes. And I'm going to explain to them how this works. But at the same time, as a trainee joining, it's important that you're responsible for your own learning. So yes, you can have a mentor, but that mentor's not going to tell you everything, right? They're not going to give you lessons. As a trainee, you go away, you read books, you look at what other divers are doing, you look at the configuration that other divers are adopting, you try things, you experiment and explore some of the techniques and ideas under the careful supervision of an experienced diver, your mentor. And that mentoring relationship, I think, is really quite unique in the sport of diving. But actually, it's interesting, before we started this call, we were talking about our professional lives and, I work in a decent-sized corporate. the concept of a mentor is actually really, really common in the corporate world, right? You know, we
Yes.
don't train people to become leaders and managers and the rest of it. We can go on a training course, but actually people have mentors. And those mentors are really, really important, I think, and it works in cave diving. I've been lucky to have mentors in cave diving and in caving. And in both sports, that's kind of led me to a high level. So I think that's a really, really important element to what the CDG does. And then because of that, and because of what we do in cave diving in the UK, a lot of it's focused around exploration, right? It's mission-orientated diving. We've got a goal to the diving that we're doing. And so everything that we do in terms of equipment configuration, in terms of developing new techniques, in terms of building bits of kit, it's all being built and worked towards an objective. We're always working towards something. So that's to solve a problem in the sump, to solve a problem in the cave. But everything we're doing and adapting our equipment has got a purpose. And I think that's really, really important to have that purpose, have that goal. And yes, it does mean our diving styles may be different to people who are just, using Sidemount as a way of having, nice trim and enjoying the sea. Yeah, and so you'll see differences in our configuration for that reason.
Yeah, and I think some of that's historical and some of it's, as you say, mission-oriented as well. And I want to cover that some more later on. Let's get it out of the way early. You mentioned that nearly 2 years ago you were involved in the Thai cave rescue as part of the British team that actually extracted the boys from the cave. And I guess time and talking about it gives you the opportunity to really process that experience. How do you look back on that now?
It's interesting. So there are weeks when I kind of, go by and I barely think about it, right? I'll be doing the day job and getting on with chores at home or whatever it is, or there'll be a crazy quarantine going on and a virus at the moment. And so, the Thai cave rescue's not even in my thoughts. And then every so often it'll come up, or I'll give a talk about it, or someone will ask me to give a presentation, or I'll write an article, and, and it all comes back. So, yeah, it's interesting to have something that's significant, I suppose, something that was that much of a major event that's in your recent past. And some of the memories are fading a little bit, but it still feels very, very fresh, a lot of what happened, and not just what happened at the time whilst we were in Thailand, but everything that happened subsequently, whether it be dealing with the media and the press back in the UK, or giving presentations and all sorts of other things that have happened, and then films and documentaries and all that stuff that's ongoing as well.
Yeah. I mean, I said it when I did Harry's interview on this way back as well. The whole world really did stop and take a breath and watch what you guys were doing. And it was just an amazing thing you did. I know you've received so many pats on the back and medals and so on, but all of that was thoroughly deserved. Here's the thing now that I think is a little specific to you. I've been personally asked to contribute to Stratus Cars's book on close calls, which talks about incidents that experienced divers have had. I think I saw you might be in there as well. But I talked to Harry a bit in episode 37 about his experiences, and he mentioned your lost line incident. Yeah. And as soon as I heard that, I thought, man, I can just in my mind go through what you might have gone through. But the one added thing was you weren't just responsible for yourself at that time, were you? You had a child under your arm and you were trying to extract them several kilometres out of a cave. So can you share a little bit about that experience and what you went through and how you solved the problem that presented itself to you?
Yeah, you've absolutely hit the nail on the head there. The key bit there was having somebody else. And I remember at the time thinking, hey, if I need to, I can get out of this. I remember thinking, I got a lot of gas, it's pretty warm. Other people come through this, so I've got a hell of a long time to look, right? And it's not a big passage. But crikey, I can't possibly contemplate leaving the boy here and trying to do that. That's just not an option. So it's back into the stuff that you learn when you train. All the standard stuff about sweeping with your arms to try and pick up that lost line. And I knew exactly where that line was. That's the thing. I knew it was diagonally up to my left. And I knew it had pinged, it'd been under tension. It slipped from my fingers, it shot back up amongst the kind of rocks up in the roof. I knew it was there somewhere. But no matter how much I swept and tried to get my hand up in there was just no way I could get at it. I did then realise, I thought, well, I know which direction this line goes in. So I thought, well, if I just go in that direction, it's not a big passage. I mean, it really wasn't huge. I'm going to pick it up as long as I keep sweeping. And so I went in that direction, kept sweeping. And rather than pick up that, I picked up an electrical cable. You don't normally find electrical cables in sumps, a bit of an unusual one. But picked up that electrical cable and then managed to follow that. And that electrical cable actually took me in a roundabout way back into the cave, which was really confusing. Surfaced somewhere I didn't recognise and then realised where I was. And Jason came by and then Harry came by. And then obviously Harry took the boy from me at that point. I guess I was in the water disorientated or off the line for all of about 5 minutes, maybe even less. I managed to control my breathing to a reasonable degree. But absolutely, I could feel the adrenaline building and the heart rate going up a little bit at that point. So yeah, put it, I don't recommend it. Hang on to that line. It's a good reminder, isn't it? A microsecond of complacency, a second where it just slipped out. I didn't grip the rope just quite tightly enough. This was on the third day. Everything had been going so smoothly that day. I'd done several trips in and out prior to that. I was pretty much out and I'd kind of nailed it. I felt like I knew the something really, really well. And you're complacent for just a second and it gets you, right? So it's a lesson. Don't lose that concentration.
Yeah, and I think many lessons there, as there are in most incidents. Number one, as you say, don't become complacent, don't lose concentration. But then when you're in the midst of it, and I remember talking to Jill Heineth about this, she talked about steps on the path to survival. What is the next thing that I need to do? I'm in this situation now. What do I need to do first? As you say, you needed to try and find the line. Okay, if you don't find the line, what's the next thing I need to do? And so you have these little steps in your mind that you need to break down a big picture into these little small pieces so that you can solve the problem in front of you.
Yeah, and it's the classic incident pit as well, right? So you're thinking, okay, I'm at the top of the incident pit, or maybe a little way down at this point because it's reasonably severe, but if I take the next step in the wrong direction, it's going to get harder, right? So I pretty much know where I am. I pretty much know the lines up to the top left, as it were. Now, if I go off in the wrong direction now, I'm going to make things even worse. It's easy to make more mistakes at that point, which makes things worse, rather than make the right decisions. And I guess when you make that next step, you've got to know if that was the right thing to do or go, that was the wrong thing to do. Let's go back a step. Because the more steps forward you go, the further and further you are away from that original incident, which, I hadn't moved, right? The line was just there.
Yeah, exactly.
So the further and further you go away from that line in trying to find it, the further and further into that incident pit potentially.
Well, yeah, I remember there was a saying, if you get lost, don't get lost-er. Yeah, exactly. I might have got that from wreck diving. I remember John Chatterton had some very similar things when I did my advanced wreck training with him, which was within a ship, there's lots of girders and pieces of ship structure that actually are your guidelines. And so take notice of them on your way in and out of the ship because they may well be your method of exit if you lose other methods, be it a strobe or be it a line. So, yeah, awesome. Thanks for sharing on that because it was something that was very particular to you and that rescue, and I also thought it was a big part of the drama. I hope they feature that in the movie when it comes out.
I'm sure they will.
So we talked a little bit earlier about the CDG and spent a bit of time on sump diving and dry caving and cave diving and so on. But can you tell us more about what you see as being the key differences between sump diving and let's call it traditional cave diving?
So I tend to think of sump divers as people who are interested in passing an underwater section of cave, but then being able to get out on the far side. So sometimes those sumps are pretty extended, and some of the top CDG divers have become very good at passing very long sumps, but still being able to get out on the far side. But it's that ability to change from dry caving mode to underwater caving mode back into dry caving mode. And because you're quite often doing exploration or you're working beyond that solid section, you're having to take with you the dry caving equipment and the dry caving clothing and the outfit, and also whatever it is you're going to do on the far side. So yes, you're going to dive maybe in your Wellington boots, you're going to dive in your caving helmet, and you're probably going to take something with you that you wouldn't normally have underwater, which might be a bag of rope or some camping equipment or a giant dry tube, but you're going to have some stuff. And of course, one of the things that we've found out in Thailand, we were all quite used to swimming underwater with a thing, whatever that thing was. Clearly not a human being, but transporting a big tackle bag, for example, was quite familiar. And it's only been, I guess it was 2 or 3 months prior to Thailand. I was out in Mexico and we were in a cave called Pino Colorado, and we're doing some multi-sump stuff, and we were at the back end of Pino Colorado, camping in a cave. I've been in the cave for about 10 days. But to get there, we had transported all sorts of crazy stuff through, including basically what's a platform that you'd have for aid climbing that would be attached to a cliff. This big platform with big aluminium bars, big aluminium tubes, and a canvas decking supported around the aluminium bars, right? This thing was huge. It was taller than me. And we just wore it on our chest, like this giant thing kind of strapped to our chest, and I just swam through the sump with it. And I guess it must have been about 5-6 kilos negative. So, I had a PCD on to compensate for that. But swimming underwater with odd-shaped bits of equipment is normal in sump diving. So the ability to transport stuff through and then get out the far side and carry on, I think that's really, really important to what we do. And the ease of transition between caving and diving and back to caving is really important. So when I talk about equipment configuration and the stuff that I wear and do, you're going to see that I've generally opting for stuff which is easy to take on and off, and stuff which can be broken down into kind of multiple parts. And, I'll discard that part for this section of the cave and I'll change over and use this bit of equipment, or depending on the cave that I'm doing. In fact, if you've got a modular system, you can take certain parts away and use something different for a different cave dive.
Yeah, it was interesting because you and I connected after I watched your excellent YouTube video on your UK side mount sump setup. And you added a whole lot of caveats to that video, which I thought was entirely appropriate. And that's really what I'd like to dig into a bit with you. Firstly, I think the first point you made is it was specific to the sump environment, but also specific to the UK sump environment, which I'm imagining can be quite different from other parts of the world. Can you share a little bit about the specific kit requirements that a sump diver might need and then weave in some of the UK stuff in there as well?
Yeah, absolutely. So UK sumps tend to be shorter, relatively shallow. So in that video, I've got a pair of 7s on. That's a typical UK setup. You might be diving down to about 20 meters if I'm diving my local cave, which is Wookie Hole. And, you might be underwater for, 20 minutes before you're able to get up into airspace, right? So they're not extended dives. So a pair of 7s is quite comfy for that kind of diving. But, you might have some other equipment with you, as I've talked about. You'll see, certainly in those videos and throughout all my equipment, photos and videos, I've typically lots of carabiners everywhere. Mm-hmm. So carabiners are always a bit of a no-no, bit of an interesting, controversial topic. The carabiner is kind of ubiquitous in the world of dry caving. There are carabiners everywhere, right? Whether that's the vertical work that we're doing, part of the rope work that we're doing, or for closing bags, or just for attaching things to anything, there's going to be a carabiner around. So given that we've taken lots of carabiners down the cave in the first place, why wouldn't we use those carabiners to attach the cylinders and things to ourselves? Mm-hmm. The water's typically fairly cold where I dive. So in the UK, I'm diving in maybe 8 degrees Celsius water, possibly cooler. But at the same time, we're not always able to wear dry suits. If we're going to get out the side of a sump and carry on a significant distance, it's not practical to do lots and lots of dry caving in a dry suit. So we're probably going to be diving in a wetsuit. It's probably going to be therefore be quite a thick wetsuit. We're probably going to have reasonably thick gloves. So everything's put together for ease of use. So nice big carabiners rather than kind of smaller, perhaps more fiddly bolt snaps makes sense. An equipment configuration that allows me to dress fairly quickly is pretty good as well. You'll also see very often in UK sumps that buoyancy device or buoyancy system is not required. So most of my diving harnesses, I've got the option of adding a buoyancy system. That buoyancy system will never be built into the harness itself. It'll always be an add-on. So like the XDEEP wing that kind of wraps around and you bungee it. Yeah, that's the classic, exactly. Very often in certain UK sumps, you won't even wear a pair of fins. So no buoyancy, no fins, and you're just kind of groveling along underwater. And put it bluntly, there's no points for style at that point. Yeah. You can't see yourself, you can't see your hand. No one else is going to see you. So trim is important because actually, it's useful to be able to wriggle through holes, and it's important that you haven't got things that are going to snag, but you're certainly not worried about how things look and the style of it as well. I make a point of having my SPGs really easily accessible. That's something in my particular configuration because, again, it's in poor visibility or I might have lots of equipment around me. I want to know exactly where those SPGs are, make sure they're really easy to see and grab hold of. So it's just about having a easy system, I suppose a comfy system for reasonably cold temperature. We're going to be wearing reasonably thick garments, certainly reasonably thick gloves, and you're operating in pretty poor visibility conditions. So simple, easy to use, and kind of reliable is the important elements to your diving configuration for sump diving, I think.
You talked about being modular. I saw you had an XDEEP harness, but you were using a different BCD. You must tend to mix and match between different bits of kit that you've got, maybe for different dives.
Yeah, absolutely. I've got a number of different harnesses from my original Martin Farr harness. I think he calls it the Explorer. That's what started me out. It's a nice harness, very classic CDG UK cave diving harness. And then more recently picked up an XDEEP harness post Thailand, which I've been experimenting with as well. I guess those XDEEP harnesses, along with a lot of the other modern harnesses, have come in the more recent era since side mount diving became popular and relatively fashionable. And it's interesting to see the style of the modern harnesses. It tends to be that the webbing that runs over your shoulder will run down the back and underneath your arm and come back into the belt behind your back. Whereas the kind of traditional UK sump diving harness, the webbing running over your shoulder will come straight down to the belt at the front.
Yeah, H harness.
Yeah, exactly. And what tends to be the case with the H harness is that will support heavier cylinders when you're out of the water a little bit more comfortably. And very often we're walking through a cave with cylinders on to get to the next flooded section.
I talked to Ed Sorensen about this a fair bit too. You will find that an H harness is easier to put on. So the mods that he did for my Sidewinder had an H harness on it because that's what he prefers. And there's no question when you're trying to put that thing on, which is not that difficult, but it's much easier. The other thing, I think the reason Patrick put the XDEEP one to the back, and a lot of them are there, is for aluminium cylinders. So you can use a sliding D-ring, which becomes a little bit more difficult with an H-harness. You kind of have to clip past the H-harness. So it's driven by cylinder selection. If you're using steels, 7 litres or even 12s for that matter, then you don't need it. You're not going to slide them that far forward anyhow, no matter how empty they become. So I find it interesting. Everything's driven by the environment, and then everything's then driven by what type of cylinders have I chosen to use, what exposure protection am I wearing, and then each step of that then drives the next part of your equipment configuration. So I imagine for you guys, as you said, getting out of the water, maybe you've got a climb in front of you once you leave the water. You're going to take a lot of your gear off. How quickly and easily can you get it on and off? I had to go over it in Australia. I did a single ropes technique course there. So we were wearing a climbing harness over the top of everything else, but it was super fun.
Yeah.
Just a little brush with that. But I started to get the idea of, if I'm wearing a climbing harness as well as a side mount harness, could that be one rather than two? I guess
Absolutely.
That's where you're going.
Yeah, and we've experimented with that as well. I've played with it a little bit. And we looked at it for the Pina Colorada expedition, and some of the divers that came along decided they wanted to, effectively dive in their climbing harness, right? So why not? Got a belt there and you can adjust that. And people had a independent, if you like, chest harness to give them somewhere to hook the bungees up to. But yeah, the cylinders were hanging off the SRT harness, the climbing harness, because it's one less thing to have to carry into the cave. And when you're carrying all your gear quite a long way, multiple kilometers to the back end of a cave, you do get to the point that every gram start.
Well, when you're going up, that's what I noticed. I took my cylinders off coming out of Baker's Cave, but I had everything else still on me. And I think I had about 20 kilos on. And here I am. I'm in a dry suit as well. I'm in 13-degree water, so reasonably cold, thick undergarments, dry suit. I'm wet. I'm wearing a side mount harness. I might add a little bit of lead in there. And then on top of that, I've got my fins and everything else. So it's 20 kilos. And of course, as a new trying to climb single rope and not necessarily doing 100% correctly either, it was a tough 15, 20 meter climb that I had out of that cave. And that's not even very far, is it? So imagine if you had to go further, it would be super tough. So thinking about that afterwards, it would have been quite easy for me to drop the side mount harness, drop my fins, drop everything. And I would have been a hell of a lot lighter, and just in a climbing harness in my dry suit. It would have been a different climb for me, I think. Hey, one thing I did notice is you tended to almost everything use standard length hoses. I don't have any standard length hoses at all on my system. Everything's short, so that there's no loops, there's no nothing. Let's talk about the reason that you decided to do that.
Yeah, so I guess it's an evolution. When I started cave diving 2006, I'm certainly not as much as a veteran as Mike Thomas, and even Mike's not that old, relatively speaking, right? So the CDG's been doing this for quite a long time, and certainly when I started, it was relatively normal to see shorter high-pressure hoses, shorter SPGs, but real funky, tiny little, 6-inch low-pressure inflators and that kind of stuff. That was pretty unusual. So we just took the normal regulators that we might have bought secondhand, maybe off eBay, and had them serviced by a friend, and kind of started off like that, right? So you're taking standard, what are basically open water regs with, I call them normal length hoses, right? So standard length hoses that were readily available, or perhaps they were regulators that were designed for back mount use, again, full length SPGs and full length low pressure inflators. So, I started taking those and saying, well, okay, how does this work for me? And I guess the first one to talk about is the SPGs. So pretty early on, I knew various people in the cave diving group that had the nice short little 6-inch SPGs, and I played with those. And I realized, well, where do I really want my SPGs? If the SPG wasn't connected by a hose, right? If that dial was just floating in air somewhere, where would I want it? Well, I'd want it just above the tops of the cylinders. I'd want it the right way up, because that's kind of nice, right? I want to have it just above the tops of the cylinders. I don't want it under my arm somewhere that I've got to feel for it. Couldn't I just have it just sitting there? I don't want it sticking up like aerials up by the side of my face, because I'm going to get snagged. I just want the dials just there above the top of the cylinders. And I thought, well, if that's what I want, and I don't want to do a 6-inch thing and double it over like that was been extremely popular in the DIR circles, to bend those hoses right round.
For deco and stage, right?
Yeah, exactly. I thought, well, I'm not so keen on that. I didn't really like the way that worked. I thought, well, why not take a full-length hose and just bend it right round? I'm not doing too much strain on the hose that way, and I can choose exactly where I want that SPG to sit. I can have it sticking up a little bit, or I can push it right down and bury it. If I take those same regulators and I put them onto any other cylinders, whether I have a chest-mounted cylinder or whether it's something I'm going to drop somewhere in a cave, whatever it is, that's going to work every time, a kind of full-length hose. So I'm certainly quite happy to see people with short hoses. If it works for you, no worries, and I can pick up one of those regulators and dive with it, and it's not going to be a problem. But personal preference, I found those long hoses just work for me. And then think about the situation we were in Thailand. We were taking some of our own regulators into the cave, but we were also taking in regulators that the Thai Navy had been using, which were just standard open water regulators with full-length hoses and everything. And the ability just to pick them up, put them on a bottle, route the hoses nicely, and get in the water was pretty important to us. It made it easy just to adopt that gear. And then the low-pressure inflator hose, I guess, is the same thing in the sense that being able to pick up any regulator and just use it's kind of nice. I haven't got to worry whether it's the left-hand reg or the right-hand reg. I haven't got to worry whether, in this particular configuration with this particular BCD, I need a 7-inch hose or a 6-inch hose. Every regulator is the same with the same length standard inflator. Whether I'm going to inflate the BCD from the right-hand cylinder or the BCD from the left-hand cylinder isn't going to matter. And maybe the hose routing isn't as neat as it could be in the most optimal situation. But if I'm changing gear around kind of regularly for different cave dives, it means it's always going to work. I'm going to be able to route it neatly. So I've just learned how to route those longer hoses in a way that I find tidy, rather than have particular left-hand cylinders, particular right-hand regs, or a hose for this particular BCD or a hose for that particular BCD.
Yeah, I hear that. And I guess when you're looking at a longer hose, there's always somewhere you can tuck it away, isn't there? You can tuck it along the cylinder, you can tuck it through your waist belt. There's always somewhere where it can become relatively streamlined. Then I guess if someone was going to criticize it as, could that become entangled on something or caught on something? Well, maybe, but probably not.
Exactly. And if I'm diving places that are that tight and that snug, chances are I'm not in a BCD. Therefore, I probably haven't got a low-pressure inflator anyway. I might be in the dry suit, but that's even unlikely as well, right? I'm in somewhere that tight, probably not in the BCD. I'm probably in a wetsuit. Probably haven't got a pair of fins on. It's different kind of diving, and then I'm going to have even less hoses everywhere. And you say that long hose, you can bury it away. Absolutely, you can bury a long hose away and make it short. But what you can't do is make a short hose even longer, right? So
exactly. Yeah, I hear. Actually, there was an interesting discussion on one of the side mount groups the other day about long hose versus short hoses. Again, just the lack of pragmatism from some of the people responding, trying to espouse that their way was the right way. And I posted on there, look, there are so many different ways to configure your side mount equipment, and the way that you configure it's going to be some kind of function of the environments that you're diving, the training that you got. I mean, if you're trained in a very specific way, that's going to guide you for a long, long time until you decide, hey, this doesn't work for me. As you say, I need to look at your equipment critically and say, what is the best thing for me to do? I've recently started diving with transmitters, so I'm interested in what you think about that, because heavens above, they're right in front of me. I mean, I don't have to look anywhere for them, and I love them. And my concern with those in the beginning was, what if these things fail? I read an article by Steve Bogarts on that as well, where he had been using them. And his point was, well, if they fail, it's just like if an SPG fails. Number one, if you've been paying attention, you should know within 10, 20 bar where your cylinders are anyhow, because you would have checked it, number one, and you will have been breathing them evenly. But then number two, provided you haven't broken your gas planning, you should have enough to get out of the cave, so you turn the dive just as you would if an SPG failed. So I think it's been really interesting, but I've been pretty impressed with how reliable they've been. They've got a little bit knocked around, so that's something that does concern me. I don't go through mega tight cave, but just going through a little bit of tight cave, they've been a little knocked around. And the same on shipwrecks every now and again. And then the same thing on a boat. There is that potential to knock your transmitter around, but they are pretty hardy. So I don't know. I've been enjoying using them, and certainly there's something about having your gas pressures right there on your wrist or on the nerd for that matter. So what do you think about them for what you guys are doing?
I think what's really interesting and really important is that none of us become stuck in the past, and nobody becomes so ingrained in what they've learned that they, are blinded to future enhancements and improvements, right? It'd be very easy for us to be stuck where you are and ignore some new ideas that come out. And something that the cave diving group's usually been very good at is being on that leading edge. Sometimes it's that bleeding edge, sometimes being those innovators. And it's right to experiment with kit and try new things. We don't all need to be out there, hopefully on the bleeding edge. A few pioneers proving stuff for us is good, and then hopefully learning from their mistakes is valuable. Whether I'll get around to trying transmitters, I don't know, but I think the important thing is to be open to the idea,
Yeah.
If I'm sitting here in a year's time and there's more and more people doing it, I shouldn't be stuck in the past saying, well, I'm a CDG sump diver, we don't dive. Okay, maybe there's something in this, maybe it's going to work. And then you need to be able to critically appraise a new piece of kit, a new technique, a new bit of equipment, whatever it is, and say, does it work for me? What do I like? What do I not like? And you need to be prepared to sometimes spend the money, realize you spent the money, You want to defend what you've spent the money on, which is very easy. We all fall into that trap, right? I've spent the money, so I'm going to say it's the best thing ever. Sometimes you go, actually, I spent the money, but it was a bad thing to spend the money on. And you know what? I'm going to go back to where I was.
Yeah, and rebreathers are probably the best example of that, aren't they?
Yeah.
Oh, my God.
Yeah, nobody's going to slag off the unit that they've just spent all that money on, right?
Yeah, I mean, having said that, I love my Sidewinder, but the sheer amount of money you're spending, not only on the kit itself, but on the training that goes with it, and how much time and effort. It's not just an investment in money, it's an investment in time as well to build hours and get yourself up to speed on whatever you're diving. It is a pretty interesting thing how you fall in love. I've seen it with cars as well, so it happens everywhere, right? So let's carry on. Is sump diving the only type of diving you do?
So I'll say cave diving is the only kind of diving I do. Occasionally, I treat myself to some kind of foreign cave diving that isn't really sump diving. I don't do wreck diving. I don't go in the sea. If I go to the local quarry here in the UK near me called Vobster, then that's going to be a training dive, excuse to kind of get in the water somewhere that's relatively sheltered and safe and practice with some kit. I just do cave diving, and I guess that's what gets me up in the morning. That's the thing that gets me excited, and that's the thing that I love.
Yeah, sure. And so we've been talking about kit. So if you went into some big cave different from sump diving and it's going to be 100% cave dive, does your kit change very much between the two? Or?
It's interesting. So if I'm doing big cave diving, I'm almost certainly going to be diving my rebreather. Mm-hmm. Okay, so suddenly everything's different. I have done almost no back mount doubles cave diving. I sort of managed to skip that phase altogether.
Congratulations.
Pretty much from, thank you, side mount UK to back mounted rebreather diving. So in that sense, yes, it will change. And I haven't had the pleasure of going to Mexico and diving in the cenotes. And I guess if I did, that's where I'd have an interesting decision to make. If I was diving open circuit side mount there, do I adapt my equipment and do I start putting in a long hose, right? A long hose on my regulator and loop it around my neck and all the other things that you expect to see in conventional side mount cave diving. And I guess the answer to that is probably comes back to something you said, I think, maybe just before we joined the call about being squared away with your gear, right? And there's a danger, isn't there, that if you pick up some piece of kit that you don't really dive very often and you don't really use and you're not really squared away, then you're introducing a complication and a risk. So I guess the answer would be if I was going out to do some cenote diving, in the tropical water in Mexico, and the people with me said, well, Chris, you've got to have a long hose loop around your neck. I'd be going to the local quarry here in the UK, and then I'd be doing some of the caves in the UK with a long hose loop around my neck to say, yeah, okay, how is this going to work for me, right? Having not got any of those trips lined up, then I haven't been doing that. But yeah, it is horses for courses is a phrase we quite often use, different gear for different environments. I think most of the UK kit and technique is transferable. Whether it's optimal in those other environments is the question, but most of it is fairly transferable. It's not always the case that some of those cave diving techniques and ideas from overseas transfer to the UK as easily.
And it is interesting. I think in the back of my mind, just the thought of doing some of the diving you guys are doing is sort of appealing in one sense from the challenge point of view, but also from the technique and skill point of view. I think it would have to be baby steps because I think the differences are quite dramatic. Most of my cave diving's been big cave, crystal clear, gin clear water. Yes, there's silt. Cave del Agua is one that comes up, which is a very, very silty cave in Spain, and I've dived that a bit. And when I went to Mount Gambier, it was a little bit of an eye-opener going through a couple of the cave sections there, particularly Engelbrecht Cave and the entrance there, where you've got, I wouldn't call it a restriction, but you've got a narrow vertical entrance and zero visibility with a rope. And so the first time going down there when that's not your wheelhouse and the first time coming out is kind of interesting. And I imagine that's a lot closer to what you guys are doing. There wasn't a lot of flow there. So that's the next thing. If you introduce flow into that same picture, then it's a different type of diving for sure. I was able to do it in the kit that I dive normally. And so just circling back to that as well, just some thoughts that came to mind to me as you were talking about transferring to Mexico. I think there's two aspects. Number one, the environment, and yes, your kit needs to be suitable for the environment. But number two, what are your skills and what are you used to diving? And are you better to take what you're used to diving into a different environment? Provided that doesn't introduce problems, then you probably are. Yeah. And just introducing a long hose because you've gone to Mexico, I don't think is the right way to look at it. It's more the reason that we use a long hose, in my opinion, for me, a lot of it is based on the team. Am I diving with a team? Are there some back mount DIR divers in this team that are going to be diving a long hose? Therefore, we're relatively the same. We're kind of equipment matched to some degree. They're quite used to seeing that. Number two, have we got some relatively narrow passage? I won't even call it restriction again, where perhaps we'll have to go through a gas sharing exit And then the long hose may offer some benefits, in fact, probably will. But in a different restriction and a different circumstance, it can be a problem as well. I talked about this a little bit too. Toddy, Thorsten Valder, they dive 1 meter hoses. They're going to swap a cylinder. You have to use aluminium for that. So there's just so many different factors. And I sort of come back to my thoughts on you going to dive a cenote would be, hey, dive your normal equipment. If you're going to use a long hose, it would be because one of your team members needed it. You don't need a long hose. It's for one of them, right? That would be the way I'd look at it.
You're absolutely right in the kind of scenario that I'm in some Mexican cenote and there's somebody there saying, these are the rules if you want to come and dive here. But otherwise, I think we're going to get onto it eventually. But the whole long hose conversation for me is, as you say, it's about team diving and it's about the style of diving, right? So when we dive, maybe I should have said this earlier, but UK cave diving is solo diving, right? So it's nice to have someone else around because it's a bit boring on your own, just chatting to yourself. But to be clear, in the water, we expect total self-reliance. So we certainly don't expect to either pass cylinders off or have long hoses for that reason. And I think it's the mindset, and this is in two ways, right? It's my mindset. So I'm not expecting to have to give anybody else any gas. And if someone was coming for some of my gas, I'm not sure how I'm going to feel about that in this purely solo environment, right? And anyone that I'm diving with that might come for some of my gas, I'm thinking we shouldn't be diving together. They probably shouldn't be in the water. Obviously, things go wrong. But actually, a false psychological crutch of a long hose and thinking, it's okay, I've got a buddy and we're doing some team diving, don't even want to go there, right? We approach it as a complete solo dive. And I don't want to think about needing someone else's gas. I don't want that thought that, well, my buddy's got a bit of extra gas. That's okay if I'm a bit close to my thirds, right? We don't even want to go there and entertain that. So, and if that means we're going to turn on quarters because it's a bit of a scary cave, then so be it. We're going to turn on quarters because it's a bit of a scary cave. And I'm going to turn on quarters because that's how I feel I'm comfortable on quarters because it's dark and it's murky and I'm concerned about the cave. I'm not going to pretend that it's okay, my body's got a long hose and we can get out of this.
There's so many perspectives on that. Here's some of my experience with that too. When I did my advanced rec with John Chatterton, I was relatively new to technical diving. So I'd done intro to cave and I was a side mount diver already. And I did it in side mount, which was another story. So I'm boat driving and ripping currents in side mount, which some people think you can't do, but trust me, you can. So that was a lot of fun. But one of John's premises is my gas is my gas. Your gas is your gas. If you have a problem, I'm going to help you, but you cannot have any of my gas. That's my contingency, not yours. So I had to think about that for a long time. And what it drives you to think is that, well, yeah, I have to be self-reliant. So yes, we're team diving, but it's self-reliant team diving. And I love that aspect of the CDG. I do a fair amount of solo diving, wreck diving here. A lot of people don't like that, but that's okay. I've got complete redundant equipment. I'm comfortable in my skills. I don't go anywhere where I don't think I can get myself out of with what I've got. But at the same time, it is nice to have other people along, but not necessarily gas sharing. So that's the first point I'd like to make is that my gas is my gas, your gas is your gas, and that is a valid way of diving. Then the other thing is that in side mount, how the hell do you have an immediate, I need gas right now incident? What has to go wrong to get to that point where you've got two completely redundant independent gas supplies? You need two major failures to happen pretty much simultaneously for that to happen. I don't believe is very likely. Can it happen? Of course, but not very likely. What's more likely is you have one failure, you deal with it, you let your buddy know, hey, I've had a failure and I'm on one cylinder now and maybe I can manage that gas. Maybe I can feather a valve. Maybe at some point I'm going to do a regulator exchange. Basically, I've got an issue and we're getting the hell out of the cave or out of whatever environment we are. And then maybe somewhere in the future, I'm going to have a low gas experience and maybe an out of gas, which is a managed process. And if you are diving in a team such that you will gas share, then that might be a gas sharing moment. And I've had two gas sharing incidents myself, both of which were incredibly benign, both of which were, oh, I think this person's going to have a bit of an issue here, have some gas. And definitely not really in a technical environment, more in a recreational environment. So in that case, I've had to do it, and then, of course, you contrast that, talking to Ed Sorensen about it, his experiences are that out-of-gas incidents are incredibly violent and usually one person dies and maybe two. Back to what you say, if somebody's coming at you and they want some of your gas and that's not part of the plan or not the way you dive, what are you going to do? Do you fight them off? I don't know.
Exactly, yeah, definitely. I think, you talking about some of your moments that you've shared gas, I certainly imagine in a teaching environment, that's why I would think very strongly about having, I'm sure an agency would insist I would anyway, but even if it didn't, you're thinking, well, I'm responsible for these people here. That's a very different relationship with the person that you're diving with, right? And if you're going to be responsible for somebody, I'm going to take even bigger cylinders or make other alterations to my diving setup and configuration so that you can give them some gas and you're still going to be absolutely fine. When you're diving with peers or equals, then, as you say, probably your gas is your gas, and if someone's coming in for some of your gas, maybe you ain't going to have enough, and maybe they're having a bit of a panic and you're both going to be in trouble.
Really interesting. So you spoke earlier about some of the exploration you're doing, and you've got videos going back to, I think, 11 years or 9 years or something on projects you've done. Can you pick a couple of exploration projects out that you've done that really stand out in your career?
I think the first one I'll pick out is one of my early projects. There's a cave out in northern Spain in the Picos de Europa called Culiembro. Culiembro is the resurgence for a cave high up on the mountains called Z2. And Z2 was explored in the early 80s, I think 81, 82. I haven't looked at the material for a while, but certainly late 70s, early 80s. And a wonderful book was written about the exploration of that cave called Beneath the Mountains. That's a proper page turner for cavers like myself. And every time I pick it up, it's a brilliant book. It really captures the feeling of being on a caving expedition, getting up every day and going down a deep cave and trying to drop more pictures and explore and map this cave. So it's a really, really enjoyable tale. And it was the deepest cave that any British cave had been explored back in the early 80s. They knew that the water from Z2 came out at the bottom of the mountain in this cave called Culiembro, but no one had made the connection, right? The bottom of Z2 ended in a sump. The dry caves had turned around and decided they certainly weren't going to be doing any cave diving down there. And throughout the kind of late 80s, early 90s, a number of people had expeditions to Culiembro, including people like Rick Stanton and Tony Seddon and various other cave divers, had made progress upstream working towards this connection with Z2. But the cave had been kind of ignored for a few years. So this historical connection was just waiting to be made. And I love exploration projects that have got what I call context. They've got kind of some history. Got a famous cave, albeit it's a kind of British cave. It's a famous cave at the top, the Z2, and then you've got a resurgence cave down the bottom that a number of high-profile top cave divers in the CDG have been working and exploring. And you've got this fantastic story, you've got all this history. And we had 2 years of visiting this cave, visiting Culiembro. And then in 2010, we made the connection. And it turned out, just luckily, I happened to be the diver in the water and in the lead in that sump. My turn to get underwater and lay some line. And okay, I must have laid, maybe it was about 30 meters, maybe 40 meters of line. So, not a great distance. It didn't extend the map very much, but what a significant extension, what a significant bit of line to lay. I remember surfacing in this chamber and thinking, oh, this looks kind of interesting. And so I swam over to one side and got out of the water, and I was looking around and I was thinking, I'd seen a photo from the end of Z2, from this deep pothole, and no one had been down this deep cave since 82, I think. So no one had been down this cave for a very long time. But there was one photo that had been published. I remember thinking, it looks a bit like it. And I looked up on the wall, and someone from their original exploration had left a marker. They'd written OUCC, so it's Oxford University Cave Club, burnt into the rock using a carbide lamp, which is obviously a very naughty thing to do. You shouldn't leave marks in a cave. But the context of seeing this was wonderful. So, a small bit of exploration, but wonderful history. And we took some photos. We came back and some photos were taken. And then I had the whole pleasure of reporting on it and talking about it and giving a presentation and meeting all the people that were around that have been part of that original exploration in the 80s from the top down. We had a dinner and stuff and all got together and, signed the book and all this stuff. So it was a lovely bit of context to exploration. I say that for me, that kind of sums up a great bit of cave exploration. You've got some history. I was very much on the shoulder of giants, doing my little step forward, an increment. And it's an opportunity to build onto that story, add to that, and do it with great people. We had a great team out there, some really good friends of mine that were part of that expedition, and we all got to share in that success as well. So that brings all those things very nicely together.
Amazing story. Yeah, and I do love that history context as well. It does make a difference, doesn't it, when there's just such a story behind, be it a shipwreck, a cave, whatever. That makes all the difference in terms of bringing some real meaning to what you're doing, doesn't it?
Yeah. Absolutely. Yeah. And carrying on the theme of books, it was a few years later that when I was reading a book that Bill Stone had written called Beyond the Deep, The Deadly Descent into the World's Most Treacherous Cave is the kind of subtitle.
Surely you wouldn't go there.
Absolutely. Right. It sounded great. It's the story of the exploration of San Agustin and Sistema Huatla down in Mexico. And I've been lucky to be part of some ongoing exploration there for many years. And in 2013 was our big expedition there. And again, it had this wonderful history, a history that went back well beyond Bill's early involvement, on for many, many years. And then all those decades where Bill Stone and Bill Steele were leading expeditions there and a couple of books being written about the place and lots of fantastic American cavers that I had a chance to interact with throughout the course of that exploration project as well. And really interesting, great guys. Got me out to another bit of the world that I hadn't had the chance to visit. And Mexico's a wonderful country, and I've really enjoyed visiting Mexico. And, we've been up in the mountains with the Mazatec people. So that's another fascinating side to Mexico that not everybody sees in the tourist areas as well. So that San Agustin project, which was luckily very successful. We kind of extended the depth of the cave and found a bunch of additional cave beyond the sump. It was kind of a pinnacle for me again in expeditions and bringing together that wonderful history. Great group of people. There's a real good buzz around kind of expedition base camp and in the cave and everybody getting on and having a great time. Fantastic cave, really great environment, and then some great successes that we could then share with everybody and a chance to reminisce with people that had been there. And I think we're the first people to be down at that sump. We were there in 2013, and I guess it was 1994 that the previous people had been there. And there were things left over from that original exploration. You're going back into the pages of the storybook, right? You could say, I've got the picture here, and now I'm stood in that same place, and I can see it, and being part of the story and carrying on and building the story for the next generation.
And so we're all locked up at the moment for COVID-19, so we just put a timestamp on where we are right now. There's going to be some pent-up fury that comes out of this when divers are finally released on the world again. Where's Chris Jewell going once you get free?
Well, so I was supposed to be right now out in Mexico doing some cave diving. So that's an expedition that we'll hope to revisit. Hopefully next March and early April, we're back to Mexico with that team. And then the rest of the year, I had planned a couple of trips to Europe, so my backyard here, trip to Spain. Well, that was going to be June, so who knows what will happen in the next couple of months.
Scratch that one. I just cancelled my truck trip. I was online yesterday cancelling all my flights to Japan and to Guam. I don't know about June, mate. Maybe September, October, November. We'll see. Huh?
I think we'll see. And I guess the good thing here, if the UK opens up a little bit and so does France and Spain, we can jump in a car or a truck or whatever, a van, fill it full of diving gear and drive down to southern France or northern Spain and do some diving. So we're not so reliant on the airlines and things opening up completely. But obviously where we are right now with people not even allowed to leave their homes, that's a long way away, I think. I'm trying to keep that dream alive. Maybe that trip gets moved back to September, I think. We'll just have to see.
Yeah, and so while we're locked up, are we going to see some more videos?
That's a good question. I was trying to think what to do next. I got a few ideas. I have a side mount rebreather that I do dive a fair bit. And I was thinking it might be kind of interesting to do a teardown on the side mount rebreather.
I would love to see that. Tell me you didn't build it yourself, though.
Well, it's put together by me. So none of the important components have been manufactured by me. All the important components come from various reputable manufacturers. So, it's got recognizable parts, got a sort of jokey mouthpiece and a scrubber from other rebreathers. But, it's configured into a side mount style, into a tube. I've got some ideas of the way in which it works for me, which I think is interesting. So maybe I'll share a video about that.
Love to see that. And have you had a go at any of the, let's call them traditional, or any of the commercially available side mount rebreathers, the Sidekick, Sidewinder, the Dive Soft Liberty, and so on?
So the only other side mount rebreather I've had to play with is the Sidewinder. So when I was out in Florida last Christmas, one of the chaps out there loaned me his Sidewinder for a few dives. That was good. I must admit, that's very clever, very well thought out rebreather. I think then it was popular. I was thinking, there's quite a few people buying these. And that was 14, 15 months ago, whatever. So now I'm crying.
It's a great piece of kit from the point of view that it's packs down into a little backpack. It's really just 2 canisters and a counterlung and a loop and a couple of heads that go on the canisters, and that's it. So simple. And I mean, what I love about it as a side mount diver is it just fits right on top of your side mount kit. So nothing changes. You need a couple of attachment points. When I say nothing, the changes are very minimal. But it is a really nice unit to dive in terms of being a side mount diver. And as I've said quite a few times, I didn't really want to put something on my back when that's really not the type of diving I've been doing. It would have been not too much change, but it just would have been more change than I wanted to make.
Yeah.
You've got all the usual stuff you have to go through, but I mean, you're a rebreather diver, so for you, it's not going to be such a problem. For me, I was a long time open circuit diver, so I started diving in the 70s, so I've got to break a lot of muscle memory to get into rebreather diving, but it happened and reasonably quickly, and Ed beat me into shape, and next thing you know, we're going out and doing some pretty nice diving in it, and I've been trying to progress that until the lockdown. My challenge in New Zealand has been cylinders. We're such a small country here, and we're quite heavily regulated. Everyone thinks New Zealand's quite progressive. It is a liberal country, but man, trying to get cylinders here is so difficult. So I had to beg, borrow, and steal a 2-litre steel cylinder for my O2 cylinder, and I've just got some 7-litre cylinders, would you believe? So what sort of country doesn't have 7-litre cylinders as standard?
Yeah.
I don't know, but this is one of them. And trying to dive my 12s was okay. You know, it's nice to have a lot of gas, but you don't really need it for the vast majority of dives that I was doing, especially on a rebreather. So it was nice to get them. They're out getting cleaned up right now, so I'm looking forward to diving them soon. So, yeah, we'll see. We'll see how that progresses. But, man, if you put that video up, I'm all over it. I'd love to see that and see what you got.
Yeah, I'll get around to that at some point. I think if you've looked more recently, there is a video of me doing some household chores in my cave diving kit. I don't know if you've seen that one.
I saw that. You stole my thunder. I was thinking if I'd had the 7-litre cylinders at home, I would have done it. But trying to do that in 12s is that's kind of your workout for the day if you're doing that. So
yeah, exactly. I'll do another serious one and then maybe another fun one, something like that. We'll see.
Go to the supermarket in your full kit.
Yeah.
All right, mate. Well, it's been a pleasure. It's been awesome to meet you in person and catch up. Obviously, I've been aware of you, especially since the Thai cave rescue. And again, just the story of that was just, you couldn't write that script, could you? You just couldn't. So amazing to catch up, and thank you for giving us your time. I learned a lot, and I really did want to dig into that sump diving versus normal cave diving, if there is such a thing as normal cave diving. So awesome to hear more about the why behind the how and to hear more about your diving. So thanks for your time. Thanks for sharing.
You're very welcome. Thanks very much for having me.
Cheers, Chris.
Cheers.
Hey, thanks so much for listening to this episode. I hope you got as much out of it as I did. It was awesome to catch up with Chris and learn more about his UK sump diving setup and about his experiences in Thailand and some of the exploration projects that he's working on right now. And again, if you'd like to become a patron of Speaking Sidemount and support the show, please go to www.patreon.com/speakingsidemount. All of the details are there to help you. And by all means, feel free to reach out to me directly via Facebook if you'd like to discuss. Thanks again, and I'll catch you in the next episode. You've been listening to Speaking Sidemount from www.sidemountpros.com. If you like the podcast, please subscribe and consider leaving us a 5-star review. If there's something you'd like us to cover on the show, then let us know via our Facebook page listed in the podcast notes. Thanks again, and we look forward to you joining us on our next episode of Speaking Sidemount.